Well, we're here to talk about Brahms today, and we're here to talk in particular about his Opus 117, the three intermezzos, or dry intermezzi, and he titled it himself, The Cradle Songs of My Sorrows, and it comes from a Scottish song, Lady Anne Bothwell's Lament by Herder, and here's the first line of that poem or song. Sleep softly, my child, sleep softly and well. It breaks my heart to see you weep. Pretty interesting little start. And, you know, we don't usually see titles like that from our composers. And so that, for me, that raised some real questions when I was first starting on the character sketches altogether. And that's Opus 116 through 119. But 117 caught my attention early on because of the title. And why would a composer go to that kind of length to title it? Usually it's their successors who title them. You think of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. He didn't name it the Emperor Concerto. His publisher or somebody else did. But here we have a real title. And so this discussion for this morning is going to look into 5 areas that may have provided the basis for this Opus 117. And questions being, what motivated Brahms to title it, The Cradle Song of My Sorrows? Another question is, why does Brahms' music resonate with us on such a deep level? You know, what is behind that? We're going to talk a little bit about the term intermezzo, and what that meant to Brahms. And then we'll have a few fun facts about Brahms and some early shaping experiences, and we'll have a few notes in particular on Opus 117, and the question being, who was Elise? We have Beethoven's Für Elise, so maybe this is the second Für Elise, right? So here's a few fun facts. First of all, Brahms' family nickname was Hannes. Hannes. He had a couple of siblings, Elizabeth, known as Elise, Friedrich, known as Fritz. And the name Brahms means broom, and this was a fairly poor family. Here's a little picture of his birthplace. This is in Hamburg in the 1830s. And he was from a poor family. He just was. The family moved around a 3 times subsequent to this. I'm not really clear, but not really up. His father was a musician, actually had his apprenticeship card and certificate, and was allowed to present that to various Kapellmeisters and try to get some work. And he struggled along. It sounds like he was an okay musician. Here's another little fun fact. His mom, Christiane, was 44 years old when Brahms was born. Oh, wow. But his father was 27.
Oh, very interesting.
17 years. Christiane was born 1789. Jacob, his father, was born in 1806. Now, that kind of answered a big question for me, because what would a 22-year-old young Brahms be interested in a 36-year-old Clara Schumann? Well, there's the model right there, besides professional musicianship and all that. And, of course, Clara was a phenomenon in her own right, so she would be impressive to anybody just by herself. However, now I see the model. It makes perfect sense to me now. So there's a 17-year age difference between mom and dad. When Jacob was courting Christiane, she thought he was joking. She was all set to be a spinster, had already made those preparations, and he kept knocking on the door. Finally, some of her friends said, you might want to take him seriously. And so she did. Elise was born first, 1831, so she's the big sister, then Hannes, and then Fritz. Elise was the older sister. They were very close. Brahms' father wanted him to learn the horn or the violin so he might someday play with the Hamburg Philharmonic. And in Brahms' father's mind, that was the extent of his son's prowess. That's how he saw his son. That's about it. If he could just get to the Hamburg Philharmonic, second fiddle, that would be great. Brahms' perfect pitch, he had absolute pitch. It was not discovered till he was age 6. Usually it happens quite a bit earlier in a musical family, and we'll discuss some things about that. He did not start piano lessons until he was 7. But he'd been begging for it since he was 5. For 2 years, he'd been asking his dad for piano lessons. How many of our students beat on our parents' door, please let me take the piano, please, please, please? Yeah, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, I'm one of those students. Okay, all right. I'll fess up. I'm there. His first piano teacher was a man named Otto Kossel, who was a student of Edward Markson. And Markson was the leading pianist in Hamburg at the time. Markson was on a first-name acquaintance with either the great masters of the time or the generation succeeding the previous generation of great masters. He was the man in Hamburg. One of the significant things that Kossel taught young Hannes was this: the fingers should be able to express what the heart feels. That was the key lesson. We're learning how to express our heart through our fingers. Very important lesson in music. Brahms moved on to Markson when he was about 10 years old. Now, Otto Kossel was begging Markson to take Brahms on, like almost every day. You got to take this guy on. You got to take this kid on. He's just a phenomenon. You got to do it. Markson is really reluctant and finally took him on. And Brahms was seen by Markson as being gifted, but it wasn't clear yet whether he was a virtuoso caliber at that time. Brahms begged Markson, we're talking 10-year-old Brahms, 10, 11, 12, begged Markson for composition lessons, just all the time. Please let me compose. And when Brahms was about 6, he had developed his own notation style, just because he's just really interested. But Markson said, no, there's no money in composition. It's just a waste of time. Don't go there. But finally, Markson relented. And it was then that Brahms really took off in his studies. He was very invigorated by it. And all of a sudden, the piano and performance and composition really were all that he wanted. That's all he wanted to do. So here's some early life shaping experiences. First of all, according to the biographies I've been reading and according to his sister, Hannes was a sweet boy. He was slender and blonde. He had a high, soft, slightly screechy voice. You might say he was a typical twerpy kid, okay? We don't see him that way. What pictures do we see of Brahms? We see him when he's old and fat with a gigantic, scraggly beard. Let me tell you, he was a late bloomer, adolescent-wise and everything else. He could not grow a beard until his late 30s, early 40s. And the weight gain is obviously due to his metabolism changing, and his eating style did not. And because up to that point, you see those pictures of him in his early 20s. He's very trim, very handsome, very handsome. Within his family experience, one thing in particular seems to be foundational regarding his self-concept, and that was Brahms felt as though he did not have his father's acceptance and approval. Brahms really wrestled with this throughout his life, and it came out in various outbursts into old age. When he would drink heavily, he would obviously have some big outbursts around others who took note of his frustration with his father and his relationship with him. Now, we don't know if his father actually disapproved of him. We do have some clues toward that end, but that's not the point. It was Brahms' perception that he appeared to be laboring under that conception that his father thought less of him. There are a few telltale examples that explain why Brahms saw it this way. One example is that Brahms' pitch perception wasn't discovered till he was 6 years old. And usually in a musical family, gifts like this, like pitch perception, are discovered when children are 3 or 4. Parents find that out real quick. Because for one thing, the child gravitates toward some sort of keyboard instrument and knows exactly where the notes are. Just plays a song or whatever. And so what this tells me is that Brahms' father was disconnected or was not closely engaged with his son to notice something like that. Even though he was a musician, he was very busy in his musical life. Another example of his father's disconnected or careless behavior is that as soon as Brahms could play well enough for money, his father got him a job in a very inappropriate place for a youngster, probably inappropriate for anybody, and we'll discuss that later. But again, this tells me, yeah, don't worry, we're getting there. Because it's foundational to his development in music. But again, this tells me that Brahms' father was not really paying close attention to the needs of his son. His father died of alcoholism, just so you know. Now, they call it some sort of cirrhosis of the liver. Brahms essentially died of something very similar. I noticed that some authority tried to cover it up and say it was pancreatic. Okay, whatever. Pretty clear that there was a drinking problem in the family, And usually with that, there's the disconnection, emotional disconnection, and other factors. So anyway, this tells me that Brahms' father is not really paying close attention to him. And in both of these examples, coupled with Brahms' rather public laments about his father's opinion of him, it appears that Brahms interpreted his father's neglect as disapproval and unacceptance. And, that's what children do with neglect. They blame themselves and then in turn blame their upbringing. And many people will stay stuck in that blaming kind of world. And they oftentimes remain emotionally stuck at that age, whatever that age may be. One additional item to note is that Brahms was noted early on as a child as being very intelligent. He was seen as extremely sharp. Of course, we know he was very creative and artistic. And so those two primary ingredients, intelligence and creativity, they translate into a very sensitive child, very sensitive. So Brahms would be especially vulnerable or susceptible to misread anything that could be construed as disapproval or rejection from an authority figure. He would just soak that up right away. He would see it, feel it, and absorb it. So that brings us to that question then that we'll ask and answer. Why does Brahms' music resonate with us on such a deep emotional level? So in the above example, we see the beginning of a discouraged and frustrated soul. On one hand, he was intelligent and gifted. He received a lot of attention, especially from his music instructors. He was now receiving 2 to 3 lessons every week. Plus, he had his regular schooling. Because he was gifted, he received most of the attention at home from his mom and sister, Elise. He was the golden child, okay, because, he just really stood out. I have a hunch that his father envied that and somehow felt that that was competition instead of recognizing that, hey, this is great, praise God. Instead, he saw it as some sort of threat. So he received a lot of doting from mom and sister, not very much from his dad. But his dad was out playing in various bands around the town. Now, Hannes began performing publicly at an early age and received a lot of attention there. But somehow none of it seemed to overcome the idea that he didn't have his father's approval. Then, when he was 12, his father saw an opportunity to make some money from his son's talent. Great, right? So he got him a job playing piano at a tavern that was really just a reception area for prostitution. It was a bordello. And so imagine a 12-year-old boy playing piano through the night at a place like that, and this is what his father wanted him to do. Think about the message that he was receiving about his value in the eyes of his dad. On one hand, during the day, Kossel, Markson were preparing him for a serious performing arts life on the concert stage. They saw him as a concert pianist, even though he's 12, 13, and 14. He'd already given some public debuts. But on the other hand, his dad has him playing pop music at night at a bordello. So again, as a young boy, it was quickly discovered he's very intelligent, creative. He's very sensitive. Brahms resented this conflict for the rest of his life. He never recovered from this. And much of his personal behavior is recorded throughout his life is symptomatic of a person who's been deeply traumatized. At age 12, he was pretty as a girl. Blonde, very slight, high voice. The women at the bar would humiliate him by sitting him in their laps, having him drink beer, and then undressing him and fondling him and passing him around. One can only imagine the deep shame and humiliation that he felt. He greatly resented those episodes. He was very angry, frustrated, and bitter about what happened there. And we see that resentment and humiliation cropping up throughout his life from various anecdotes and his self-destructive behavior. That's pretty well documented. To cope, he learned to read books from the music stand while playing the piano. So he'd memorize all the dumb songs he was playing. And he'd bring literature that he wanted to read, and he'd read that through the night until he was harassed and whatever. And so it was here that he learned how to check out or dissociate or disconnect from his feelings and disassociate or disconnect from others. The silver lining here is that it taught him to be able to concentrate very deeply on his music. The downside was he was unable to get close to anyone else except for his sister Elise. And he communicated with her by letter throughout her entire life and his life. She represented the one person throughout his entire life who posed no threat to him, either personally or professionally. The record does not show if he had any adults to talk to about what happened for those 2 years that he worked at the bordello, but it's likely that he learned to live a double life at this time. Moving from the classy music studios in Hamburg with Markson and Kossel, and then working at night in the brothel. It appears that neither of his instructors had any idea what was going on. So that's the evidence for a double life. I'm this person now, and I'm this other person during the day. So basically, he was left unable to express his feelings, his shame and humiliation. None of that could be expressed in a healthy and constructive manner with others. It also had the effect of causing him to feel very insecure and inadequate in general, and particularly around women, especially attractive women. He would get really silly when they entered the room, just a sign of deep insecurity and inadequacy. In fact, he spent a considerable amount of time attempting to reconcile his trauma in the worst way, and that was by frequent visits to brothels. One telltale sign of his attempts to be reconciled was that it was well known he was very kind and considerate to his escorts. There's several times where he'd be waved at on the sidewalk during the day by a prostitute who's his friend, and his associates would say, "Well, how do you know her?" And it was kind of embarrassing for him, but he was very kindly to them. And that shows an approval-seeking mindset or desire for acceptance and reconciliation, which is it's symptomatic of a result of trauma. Hannes got a big break from the bar scene when a family friend took him out to the country to teach his daughter piano for 2 summers. This was huge. He had a chance to meet up with teens his own age, get out of Hamburg, and enjoy hikes in the woods and reading literature and doing just normal kid things. And taking hikes in the hills and woods became a lifelong custom for him. He really loved it. It was just a time to unwind and think and just get some fresh air. And now, while in the country setting, there was one negative experience that appears to be a telltale sign of damage left over from the bar job. He was by himself by a riverside practicing on his silent keyboard. Some local boys teased him and roughed him up and took his things. His friend, Elise, was the girl he was teaching piano to. She found him crying by the riverside and upset and appearing helpless. Kind of shocked her that he just sort of was apathetic about it. So she, Elise, overtook the boys and demanded his belongings back. My takeaway from that is that he didn't feel like he had any right to defend himself. And again, this is a common resulting effect of someone who's been traumatized or abused. So here's a summary behind Brahms' musical development. So why does his music touch us so deeply? We begin to see that he internalized a negative self-concept by seeing his father's conduct as disapproval, and of him, Brahms, Hannes, not being worthy of love and acceptance at the highest level, really. And then by attaching his 2-year traumatic experience at the brothel as confirmation of his low value and negative self-concept. So that self-concept that was developed, that he internalized with respect to whether his father approved of him or not, which was low, was then confirmed by the traumatic experience that he had for 2 years. But he also developed the ability to concentrate deeply and intently through disconnecting from others and his surroundings, literally tuning others out at will. He was not really big on trivial small talk with other individuals unless you were a professional musician and had something to offer. And if you just had nothing to offer, basically he would just listen to you for a moment and he might just walk away. He wouldn't say, "I have to go, excuse me, see you later, have a nice day." He would just leave because, he could do that. He knew how to do that. But because he did not recover from his experiences, nor did he learn how to constructively share his difficult and challenging feelings of grief, hurt, loss with others, he needed to develop other outlets for expression. Obviously, right? I guess thank goodness for that. So enter music composition. And I was thinking that maybe Brahms was the originator of music therapy, right? He's the first one. So obviously the primary constructive outlet for Brahms was music composition. And composition provided a lifelong outlet for expression. It was his unresolved, unreconciled mental and emotional trauma that provided the deep need and motivation for expression. And then it was this, coupled with his early Bach studies with Marx, and Marxen focused on Bach with Brahms. And that's what provided the intellectual and structural material for complex and deep musical expression and work. So there's another plug for the Bach. When they whine about the inventions and sinfonias, so what? Remember Brahms. Push it. So I want to shift gears here and discuss briefly the geographic and attitudinal setting for this composition, along with the other character pieces, or they're sometimes called the miniatures. And we're talking about Opus 116 through 119, all composed during the summers of 1892 and 1893. First of all, there's a big attitudinal statement that sets the stage for what Brahms wanted to accomplish that summer of 1892, and he completed it through 1893. And this statement provides the mental context for Brahms during this summer. And Brahms makes this statement to Clara in a letter, and he says this: "Now I am composing for myself alone." It's a big statement. Now I'm composing for myself alone. And he's speaking specifically at the time of Opus 116, as he was thinking he was going to start there. And some authority speculates that it's probable that he already had the sketches for 116 prepared, perhaps from the previous winter. But he ended up composing and finishing the piece we'll hear today, Opus 117. He did that first. We'll address the reasons why here in just a moment. So it's with this mindset that he prepares for his summer work. Now I have a photo of the home that he rented in Bad Ischl. It's just so you know, it's about a 3-hour drive from Vienna. And in Brahms' time, you're welcome to pass that around. In Brahms' time, the train went out to there. So it was about a 3-hour train ride today, 3.5 hours. Brahms rented the second floor each summer beginning in 1889. And Bad Ischl had a medical spa which brought lots of summer visitors, and Brahms didn't like that. But what he did like is the following criteria. First of all, the home is on the outskirts of town, and it's away from people and traffic. It overlooked the River Traun with a beautiful view, so he liked that. So you see the windows. He could look out through the windows, see the river, the setting, kind of reset himself there. It was also nestled up against the hills and woods for his daily walks, and he really liked that. It was also close enough, though, for his friends to come and visit during the summer. He had a favorite cafe in town. The owner, of course, was very grateful to have his big-time celebrity guest every day. So he gave Brahms a special table in front of the window to the cafe, which Brahms could take or leave. He would rather be in a corner in the back. But Brahms was a celebrity in his own time, and he had a celebrity mask that he could put on. And he was such a big celebrity, he could say anything, and everybody would just take it, eat it up, whatever. It could be completely inappropriate, as it sometimes was in private settings with others. Everybody just shrugged their shoulders and go with it, because he was big time. It's a good thing he didn't live today, I guess. He would flood the internet all the time, because he would just open his mouth. So now we have both the attitudinal contexts for these pieces and we have the geographic setting. So let's move on to a brief word about the character sketches themselves. Opus 116 through 119. First of all, there's 20 pieces that comprise the character sketches or miniatures. They're all composed in the summers of 1892 and 1893. 14 of them are titled intermezzo. 3 are titled capriccio. Even these have several areas where the inner voice must be identified in order to receive special treatment. Otherwise, you're going to miss the point of the piece. 1 is titled Romance. The Romance is filled with intermezzo, conceptual melodic lines. 1 is titled Ballade, and this is one of the few pieces in the character pieces that has almost no inner voice treatment. It's one of the only ones. There's a little bit here and there, but not much. And finally, there's 1 titled Rhapsody. And that one is, that's the very last piece of the character sketches. On just kind of an interesting note, the very first piece of the character sketches, Opus 116, is an energetic piece in D minor, I haven't done much with the Rhapsody yet, but that's an energetic piece at the end. So it's like he has a ta-da and then a ta-da at the end. And it can't be a mistake. Brahms is pretty meticulous about the way he handled his composition. So the next question is, what is the intermezzo and what did it mean to Brahms? Well, intermezzo is used in a variety of ways in the performing arts. The gist of it is that of a hidden or ulterior motive or agenda, oftentimes negative or fraudulent. But in music, particularly keyboard genres, it refers to an inner or hidden voice. These are melodic lines that are formed usually in the interior voices, but those melodic lines are the dominant voice in the piece, and they deserve a lot of very careful treatment, or else one will miss the piece. It'll just be a glob of notes. So I guess in some ways the intermezzo is the vindication of the viola or something like that, or the alto, second soprano, tenor. Brahms was schooled in the inner voice by Markson with his Bach studies. And then later in his 2 years with Robert Schumann, his understanding of the inner voice or inner melody was greatly expanded, big time. One thing to note is this: his 2 years with Robert Schumann when he was 20 to 22 were somewhat golden years for him. Doors were opening for him very quickly. He was getting great acclaim, in part from Schumann, who is very prominent and well-known and respected for his writings, especially about music. And he just raved about young Brahms. And of course, he was getting acclaim on his own merit. So it seems that as he was composing these pieces for himself, it seems like he's also reminiscing over his good times with Robert Schumann and others. Brahms was a tremendous intellect. And so for him, the intermezzo is really something of his idea of a very complex musical puzzle, except that this puzzle may have many interesting solutions. And it really demands a lot from the artist. I notice almost every time I re-study one of these pieces, I find a dozen, or not a dozen, but at least a handful of things I didn't see before. In fact, just the other day, Jancy pointed out a melody line I missed on the first of these three, which I've been trying to incorporate. And I thought, wow, how did I miss that? But there it is. You know, that's just the nature of these complex musical puzzles. And they challenge the pianist to look ever deeper into the music and to continue to mine those depths therein. And if the pianist will take up that challenge, he or she will be rewarded with an ever-increasing depth of understanding of what Brahms is doing. It really doesn't disappoint. So that kind of begs the question, and what was Brahms doing with the intermezzo concept? You know, based on his personal struggles, his inability to connect in a close and healthy and trusting manner with others, it appears that the intermezzo is one of his tools for dealing with deep feelings, perhaps unresolved inner conflict, his way of communicating and discharging internal emotional challenges and difficulties, feelings that he was unable to verbally express to others. And you have to remember, Brahms is composing these pieces for himself, these 20 pieces. So in a way, we're sort of witnessing something comparable to his personal diary expressed musically. Again, the beauty of this genre and approach for the modern player is that these character pieces are similar to the Chopin preludes in the sense that as one grows as a musician, these pieces continue to yield ever greater artistic satisfaction. And finally, now let's look at Opus 117 in particular. We need to ask and answer what specifically was going on in Brahms' life that motivated him, motivated these particular pieces, these three special intermezzi. Well, as he was preparing for his summer composition work, his sister, his beloved sister Elise, died June 11th, 1892. She'd suffered with illness all her life. She was always sickly. She did finally marry. But then this particular past winter, 1891 and 2, and spring were just awful for her. And actually, there's some great relief when she passed on. Brahms and Elise, I should say Hannes and Elise, communicated by letter constantly. And it was Elise who kept Hannes up to date on family, the neighborhood, old friends, what was going on. She basically kept him connected, and connected in ways that he was not able to connect. And that was very difficult for him, as we know. Brahms requested all the letters that he had sent to Elise, and he was surprised at how many letters she had kept. and he burned them all, except he could not bring himself to burn her letters. And so he began composing Opus 117 ahead of 116 because of her passing. There's two accounts of Brahms grieving the loss of his sister. Both involve his early biographer, Max Kalbeck. Max came to Bad Ischl to visit Brahms because they were fairly close, and as close as Brahms would let somebody, right? Max went to take a walk in the woods in the morning, and he looked out and saw in the distance a person who looked like a peasant rushing toward him. Max realized it was Brahms. He was wild-eyed and running, weeping, gasping, and sweating, with his coat dragging on the dewy morning ground. Brahms then brushed right past Max and disappeared in the distance, apparently without seeing Max at all. He was completely out of it. On another day, Max dropped by the house to check on Brahms, and he noticed that the door to the studio was open. And from inside, he could hear pealing piano music. Stopping and starting, passages repeated over and over with tiny changes, Max realized that Brahms was composing or revising a piece. But as the music changed and grew under Brahms' hands, there arose an accompaniment of the strangest growling, whining, and moaning, which at the height of the musical climax changed into a loud howl. Max thought that maybe perhaps Brahms had obtained a dog, which was very unlikely. Then Max heard the scrape of the piano stool, and he went in to find Brahms alone in the room, his face red and beard glistening with tears. Brahms was embarrassed and wiped his face with the back of his hand and slowly returned to his usual joking self. So he couldn't afford to be transparent about his grief. He referred back to his sense of humor to cover that up. So Brahms was composing Opus 117. It sounds to me like he was likely to have been composing or working on the second intermezzo of the three, because it's the only piece with pealing piano sounds, really. It's also interesting that Clara Schumann liked the first two, number one and number three, and then later came back and said number two was her favorite. So it's very clear that Brahms was grieving the loss of his sister during this time, and he was using the only tool he had for expressing his grief. That's composition, and then using the intermezzo type style. So Brahms titled these three intermezzi the cradle songs or lullabies of my sorrows. And so here's a brief word on what appears to be transpiring in these three intermezzi. The first one in E-flat begins with a simple hymn-like melody with church bells ringing in the background. And this first section sounds sentimental and reminiscing. It appears to be Brahms' outward or congregational or public display of grief. It also sounds like a service being held in a small country church as opposed to a downtown cathedral setting. Recall that for Brahms, it was a tremendous relief to get out to the country and away from Hamburg and his ghastly night job. The middle section is weeping and sobbing, full of grief over loss. And this section appears to demonstrate Brahms' internal feelings of loss for his sister. It's filled with what I call the Brahmsian angst, those typical Brahms melodic and harmonic combinations that place some tension on our heartstrings. And the final section is a recap, and it's even more sentimental than the first section. The church bells are higher in pitch and begin to fade into the distance, like walking away now from the church service, and perhaps suggesting that Elise is now resting in better hands in heaven. The second intermezzo in B-flat minor, I've nicknamed this piece the Conversation. And it appears to be a close and intimate conversation between Brahms and his sister Elise. So it's an exchange between Hans and Elise, right? Hannes and Elise. It begins with a very soft singing entreaty and exchange. Elise, with a soft, weak, higher voice, answered and supported by Brahms' somewhat awkward responses. Brahms, as part of the conversation, is foundational in both the bass and tenor, and it appears to answer and also guide the higher voice. Of note, Brahms supported his sister for her entire adult life and was constantly worried about her well-being. In return, Elise absolutely adored her very talented and creative brother, Hannes. When he would perform in Hamburg, she would attend every concert and often weep through the performance. The middle section of the second intermezzo is sweet and dreamy, and it seems to be an attempt to reconcile something between them. What that is, we may never know. It then segues into the final section. The final section recaps the theme and then appears to be elevated into the spiritual atmosphere before settling down to reconcile the first and middle sections. The third intermezzo in C-sharp minor, I've nicknamed this piece a miniature requiem. It does not follow Roman Catholic structure, but it does have some resemblance to the German Lutheran requiem structure. This intermezzo begins with a dark and halting theme, which reemerges with various accompaniments several times throughout the piece. It's melancholy and sobbing. It's full of discouraged and biting grief. It then changes color with the middle section, which sounds like fantasy, as though someone's mind is drifting away during a eulogy. The fantasy episode is dreamy and attempts to be hopeful on occasion, but then it turns darker and full of angst in the second part of the section. Then finally exhausts itself and segues into the final section. And the final section is a poignant and even more halting recap of the main theme. The piece finishes with a grim finality of the realization that Elise is gone. She's gone. One final note to consider before I share these three pieces is that, as previously noted, Brahms was severely traumatized between the ages of 12 and 14. And when a person suffers trauma such as this, and it goes unresolved, unreconciled, in other words, they're not able to work through it in a healthy manner, they often end up emotionally stuck at that age level. They will usually continue to grow intellectually, as Brahms did, but they stay stuck emotionally, underdeveloped. And this is a huge frustration for people of tremendous intellect. It frustrates them no end that they seemingly cannot outthink their internal issues. No matter what they do, no matter how hard they work, regardless of how much personal, professional success they may achieve. So in a very real sense, what you're about to hear is 12-year-old Hannes saying goodbye to his big sister. Wow. Elise was the one sister, girl, woman, lady who loved him dearly and unconditionally. Never hurt him, never caused him any grief whatsoever. And now this 12-year-old boy, brokenhearted and grief-stricken, is doing his best to honor her and say a final goodbye. Bye.